This is our reference photo for this painting. I remember seeing this house back in Chico, California, and I liked how the sun hits the front and casts these sharp and dark shadows. It's also fairly simple, so it will make a good value study. I don't live in Chico, so I had my mom go to this house and take this photo, so thanks, Mom. I've actually tried making this painting 6 times in the past month. 3 attempts failed with just the initial wash of the sky, but this was my first actual rough draft. I was just trying to figure out the colors with this one and how I wanted to go about painting this, so it's not saturated and the drawing's wrong. It really sucks, but I don't care. This second one I thought was going really well, and it was going to be the final draft until I looked at the completed painting. It just came out super flat and uninteresting. This is because the contrast of the lights and shadows is just too small of a difference. The shadow cast by the overhang and on the side of the house is just too soft and light. It really lacks 3-dimensionality. So I failed at the whole point of this value exercise. This is going to be another Edward Hopper study where we keep the painting simple and focus on the contrast between light values. Copying the masters is a great way to improve. Here's some Hopper paintings, which style I'm trying to kind of imitate and reach. You can see how they really focus on light values. There's an emphasis on the contrast between the faces of the buildings that are being hit by direct sunlight and then the shadows that they cast. That's the property we're trying to improve at. Just from this second draft, you could tell it does not look like an Edward Hopper painting at all, but you get the idea. The final draft is much better and we get closer to what we're going for though. So I'm starting off with a wet on dry gradient wash for the sky, and I'm creating about a half cerulean, half ultramarine mixture. This creates a nice light blue for a spring sky. I feel like if I just use ultramarine, it comes off a bit too dark and deep. And I'm creating 2 pools of the paint on my palette, with the bottom one being a little bit more diluted because that's the wash I'm going to start off with. First, I'm applying the paint directly onto the paper, pretty wet and diluted, because I know I'm going to go back over it with another layer of paint to kind of darken it up. And my board is on a slight incline, so the water flows towards me, and that allows me to create the smooth wash. And as I go down, I add more water to my pigment so it gets lighter. And it's important as you're doing this to just keep going back up and mixing the paint on the paper. This just keeps it from drying out. And now I'm adding the second layer, and I'm just doing the same thing, adding a little bit more water as I go down and just mixing the paint on the paper. And then at the very end, it's good to just mix it all together as much as possible like that. There's me. So after applying the wash, I'll take the board and I'll have the top pointing down at an angle. This allows the paint to run towards the top and it amplifies the gradient effect. And then I'll make sure to remove all the water on the tape so it doesn't flow back into the painting and create a bloom. If the board is tilted for a while, water will start pooling at the top, and you want it to dry smoothly across the entire wash. So what I'll do is I'll point it back down so the water flows back, and I'll just kind of eyeball it, tilting the board up and down, trying to keep the gradient, but also trying to get the water to dry smoothly. Here, a fiber from my paintbrush fell into the wash, and that would cause it to leave kind of a weird spot when it dries. So I tried getting it out with paperclip and some tweezers, and it takes me a while. And where the fiber was left kind of a weird dark spot, so I take a dry brush and kind of lighten that up. Then I let it dry at an angle to preserve the gradient. And then I remove the taped off portions of our painting. Pretty cool. In the top left-hand corner of this wash, it's a little splotchy with some white spots, and I have no idea what caused that. I'm thinking it's a paper defect, or I stretched this paper in my bathtub, so maybe some soap got on it. I don't know. This is a value study though, so this is good enough. Now I am starting the important part of the painting, and I am using a super diluted and light yellow ochre for the parts of the house that are being hit by direct sunlight. I'm leaving small little spots unpainted just to give it a little bit of texture, and the reason I'm painting this first is you always want to paint the lightest part of your paintings first. Okay, so now I'm painting the portion of the roof that is being hit by direct sunlight, and I use my favorite mixture of burnt sienna and ultramarine. It creates a gray, and it's super easy to warm up or cool down by just adding burnt sienna or ultramarine. And I want to keep this pretty warm since the sun is hitting it, and I'm keeping it pretty light because the other portions of the roof are super dark, and I'm making sure to leave a little bit of texture by leaving some spots unpainted and mixing a little bit of blue and a little bit of burnt sienna in certain areas just to make it a little bit more interesting. I know I said you should paint the lightest parts of your painting first, but I've painted this like 6 times, and the body of the house is the part of the painting that I really want to get right, so I'm just going to focus on that first. There's this piece of white trim on the roof here, and I'm going to separate that from the side of the house by painting it separately and a different color. Since it's white, it's going to be a little bit more blue, where the side of the house is going to be painted with a little bit more of a yellowish tint. I'm going to use this small area where the gutter creates a shadow to kind of test how dark I want the shadows of the house to be. And I'm just using a dark gray of ultramarine and burnt sienna. I can tell from the photo that the shadow on the house there is a bit darker than the light part of the roof, so that's what I'll be aiming for. And then I'll just paint the light gray of the curtains in this window. At this stage of the painting, we don't want to go into any detail, we just want to put blocks of color down. The windows on the right side of the house is a part of the second draft that I thought I messed up. I thought I went too light, so I'm going to make sure to go a bit darker this try. And how I'm making this color is just ultramarine with a little bit of burnt sienna to make a really dark bluish gray. On this rightmost window, I put a bit too much water in and it bloomed out, so I'm just going to redo it. While it's still wet, you could just dab the paint with a paper towel to lift it, but you don't want to do this too many times because it'll disturb the paper and you'll overwork it and it'll look really sloppy. Now I am going to paint the most important part of this painting, which is this right-hand side of the house. And this is really where our value study comes into play. It's kind of the largest and starkest difference between values, and it's really what's going to sell this painting. In my second draft, I went way too light, and I think that's what ruined the painting, is this one part. So I'm using a gray with a little bit of yellow ochre to give it a yellow tint. There I went too dark, so I lift it. And then I go back over it with some water to lift it even more. And then I lighten my mix up just a bit. You just want to get this perfect. From the photo, I could tell that it's a little darker than the light side of the roof. I leave a vertical sliver of white on the left because there's a gutter drain that the sun is hitting in the photo. And I think that creates a cool effect in the painting when I leave that. Definitely makes it a little bit more interesting. And then as I go to the right, the house is actually getting further in the distance, and to create depth, I add a little bit more blue. This is the idea that as things go further into the background, they cool down, so we could use the temperature of our colors in order to achieve some more depth. Now I'm going to paint the shadows on the left side of the house, and in the reference photo, these shadows are a bit more warm, so I'm going to add some more yellow ochre. It seems like the sun is kind of going through that overhang and illuminating it just a little bit. I'm going to paint each pane that is casted in shadow separately because they're all slightly different. By looking at our reference photo, that first shadow seems the lightest. I am going to redo these shadows because I feel like I'm going a bit too dark with them. They shouldn't be darker than the right side of the house. But I'm going to follow the same idea. I probably should have painted this gutter while I painted that side of the house. It is white, so it's a slightly different color, but it doesn't really come out in the reference photo. So it would have been easier to just do it all in one go. So I just painted in trying to match it. And the shadow that the overhang casts here, I want to go nice and dark because I feel like this is a really interesting shadow and I want to get it to stand out, but I went too dark and it looks a little strange. So I'm going to redo that with a slightly lighter gray. I'm going to try to really get it to match that right side of the house. And then there's these two shadows next to the door that are facing us that have this cool effect where it seems like they are illuminated at the top and then get darker as they go down. So I try to recreate that by starting with yellow ochre and then transitioning into more of a gray color. So I'm going to do them exactly the same way, just a little bit lighter. And I'm just going to be conscious of the fact that watercolor dries slightly lighter than when you paint it down. Getting these shadows was really difficult because it's a really weird color of gray and yellow, and it's hard to make it not look just like mud. With areas like this, I'll take my reference photo and then zoom all the way into it just so I could only see that one color, just so I could see what it looks like completely isolated. While I wait for the part that I lifted to dry, I'm going to clean up some spots where I overpainted and then add in some small shadows on the house. Like on these curtains here. And you don't have to go too detailed, just get the general shapes. The smallest amount of paint really works. That is something I learned from the Edward Hopper style. And this shadow, I really wanted to stand out, so I added a bit more detail than the others, letting some holes of light poke through, and then giving it the serrated edge of that overhang. Now that I've gotten the super important blocks of color on the house out of the way, we could continue with the rest of the painting. And I start with the chimney, which is just burnt sienna and crimson. I paint the side of this overhang here. The shadow is just about as dark as the rest of the shadows. I think I painted it a bit too blue. In the reference photo, it looks more gray. I'll just say it makes the painting a little bit more dynamic. Now I could kind of put the base layers on the rest of the painting. And for that little patio, it's just some burnt sienna and burnt umber. We want to keep things light at first and then build detail as we go darker on top of those layers. The shadow on the overhang here is a bit darker than the shadow on the house, so that's what I'm going for. That's where our value study comes into play. I'm procrastinating doing the lawn because that's going to be kind of a complicated wash, so I'm just doing some detail work on the house, and with stuff like this, you don't want to get too detailed, you really just want to leave an impression. I feel like the impression implies more detail than painting actual detail would. The shadows on these dark blue-gray windows are some of the darkest parts of our painting, so that's kind of what I'm keeping in mind. I really want to go dark here. It's all about just studying your reference photo and identifying your lights and your midtones and your darks. You want it to be so even if you viewed your painting in black and white, it would still look good. With this shadow here, I went a bit too dark. In the reference photo, it's just the slightest hint darker than the rest of the wall. It's just pretty hard putting dark on top of something that's already pretty dark and getting it just right. And with this vent thing here, I went too dark. It's just hard to get that right, so it takes me a few tries. Now I've decided it's time to stop dilly-dallying and actually paint the lawn, so I'm preparing by painting all the light objects that the lawn is going to be next to and touch, just so I stick to my light to dark rule. And with that concrete slab on the yard, the lawn is going to kind of overlap that, so I want to paint that first. And then to start the lawn, I really want to keep it really nice and yellow and bright, at least at the start, because that's the part of the lawn that the sun is really hitting. I'm trying to add some blue to mix the color up a bit, but I put way too much water in it, so it bloomed into the drier, lighter green area, so I just have to restart the whole thing. And it's not so much of a big deal if I really lift it and do it right the next time. I don't get too scared about overworking the paper until I do it like 3 times. Then I start freaking out. So I'm going to do that wash again, but just really pay attention to the amount of water on my brush so I don't create any blooms. And I just want to keep that one area super yellow so it's well lit. That's really what I care about here. I'm leaving some little strips of white in the wash as well. I feel like that creates an effect that the sun is kind of reflecting off the grass. It adds a bit more detail. Now I'm going to start the wash of the other side of the lawn, and the lawn in this corner is a bit cooler, so add some depth. And I do this wash twice as well. I mess it up the exact same way I messed up the first wash the first time. I feel like this side is a bit more complicated because there's some grays and browns in here of the driveway. And I just want to keep these colors really saturated. I want to make my painting colorful. Just look at that. That looks horrible. So I'm going to lift it. And I'm just going to do that wash again. When you're mixing and dropping in colors, you always want a drier brush than you think. It has to be exactly the same amount of water or less. That's just how you avoid water blooming out into paint that's slightly drier. And now I'm going to paint this dark back section of the roof. If I squint at the reference photo, I could tell that it's a bit darker than the shadow on the house, but I think I messed up here by going a bit too dark. And in the reference photo, it's a bit bluer than what I paint. Mine's a bit too gray, so I missed out on an opportunity for some depth. I thought about lifting it, but something this dark is kind of hard to lift, so I thought it wasn't too bad, so I left it alone. Now I'm going to paint the shadow on this part of the roof over here, and we cannot be a baby. This is one of the darkest parts of our painting, so we got to make a super dark gray. I'm not using a lot of water. It's got to be super dark, so it takes me a while to paint this in. Now I have most of the painting down, so we can kind of switch to some more detail work, and I'll start with the truck over here. I make a teal color with some cerulean and just a tiny bit of cadmium yellow. And I'm not going to add a lot of detail. I'm just going to put large blocks of color down. I'm going to paint the light part of this bush first. I'm going to add some speckles of white to add some detail. I'm going to be a little bit more detailed here as well. Just because this is a natural object, you know, it's a plant. So it's going to be a little bit more crazy. Just continuing with the detail, I'm going to add some texture to the patio. But I went too crazy there, so we lift it and we try again. Add some lines to imply shadow. And we're going to start adding in our darks on the house. I'm going to add multiple layers to this door here just to paint the shadow in. So it's going to start pretty light because there's part of that door that's not hit by shadow. And it's going to be easier to overlay the dark parts than to try to put it next to each other. That just leaves lines where it's not necessary. I'm going to paint the door back here just with some cadmium red and ultramarine to make kind of a purple color. I think I'm going to go over that again to make it a little deeper. And then the windows on the dark side of the house are kind of a tricky part. There's lots of different reflections and values in them. So I'm just looking at what the lightest parts are going to be and painting those in now. And I want to make them a bit darker than even what my eye sees. There's like an illusion when things are next to super dark objects, they appear lighter, but in reality, those spaces on the windows that are reflecting light are still pretty dark. I started painting the darker shadows on that door, but I only painted in one section. I know I said I was going to overlay it, so we'll see what happens, I guess. I'm adding some detail to this overhang. We just want to keep it super light, not too rigid. And then I paint that super dark shadow on the door. I was probably thinking that since I'm going to paint it pretty dry without any water, it wouldn't leave a line anyways. And on these windows, what I'm actually painting here is going to be the window frames. I'm just going to paint the super dark window panes on top of that, and then leave some of that gray to act as the frame. I paint some details on these windows here. I think I could have gone a little bit further and done them a little cleaner. I tried being a little messy, but I think it would have looked better if I just did nice clean lines. It just looks a little strange like that. And then I go back over that shadow on the door because it was not dark enough. You have to have the courage to go dark if you want to add true depth to your paintings. With these steps here, I gotta go dark. They are super dark in the reference photo. And we could add just some slivers of dark gray to that concrete slab to make it a bit more three-dimensional. This is an interesting part of the painting. This right side of the truck, by kind of analyzing the reference photo and studying it, it's actually kind of a cool bluish gray. It's a strange reflection. So we just paint what we see. You know, I had to quit caffeine recently because I was drinking way too many Monsters and they started giving me breathing problems. So after quitting, I had like the worst headache of my entire life for 3 days. But 2 months later, I feel pretty normal. I thought quitting caffeine would be something that I would just never do, like it would be impossible. But now that I've done the impossible, quitting other things really isn't that big of a deal. So I've quit walking, I've quit going outside, I've quit everything except watercolor painting in the Edward Hopper style. Now I'm going to paint the barn as it comes to the truck's windshield, and in the reference photo I could tell that the truck's windshield kind of blue shifts it, so I'm going to add a bit of blue, make it a little green tinted. I'm going to remove some of that blue gray on the truck, make it a little lighter to make it look a bit more reflective. Now I'm going to paint the curtains in this window here. In the reference photo, it's almost the same value or even lighter than the shadow on the house. I think I messed up the shadow on the house. It should be a little more yellow tinted because those curtains should be a lot grayer than the rest of the house. I feel like that color is kind of hard to make with my palette. My palette's pretty limited. I could have spent more time trying to figure it out though. But this is a value study, not a color study, right? These window panes are quite a bit darker than the shadow on the house, so I'll make sure to get that right. You really just want to study different values in relation to each other. Like how light or dark is something next to something that's already pretty dark, or how does it relate to my lightest lights and my darkest darks on the entire painting? It's just all gotta kind of web together. Now I'm going to paint this tree in the background that's lost all of its leaves. This is probably the worst part of the painting. I don't really know what Edward Hopper would paint this like. I try to kind of interpret what he would do. I try to keep it as simple as possible. And in the reference photo, it's all a super similar color, so I'm not going to add a lot of variation in color. One thing I think that might have helped is I think I painted it a bit too dark and opaque. It's far in the background, so if I did a little bit more transparent, maybe a little bit more toned down, it would have fallen into the background a little better. The edges are just a bit too sharp. I think Edward Hopper would have painted it a little bit more abstract and impressionistic compared to what I did. As things get further into the background, they get less detailed and less sharp, so I even realized that and I decided to kind of lift the edges a bit to smooth those out. After painting this, I found this artist named Stanislaw Zoladz, and he paints this kind of tree just perfectly. I'll probably try to copy him when I paint a tree like that again, but I'll try to combine it with the style I'm going for, which is a little bit more impressionistic and abstract and simple. I'm going to paint the tree in this orchard the same way. Try to give it a little bit of detail, but make it simple but still natural looking. Add a bit more detail at the top just to simulate some branches. And I did mess up. I'm going to paint this area a little darker green to act as the ground. So I removed the bottom of the tree. Now I'm going to paint the shadow part of the bush at the front. And this is super important. This is one of the darkest parts of our painting, so I'm using very little water. I mix a really nice dark gray red color, almost magenta. And I keep mixing it just to make it as opaque and thick as possible. In the reference photo, it's all just this one dark color, very little detail, so I just kind of try to paint the silhouette as I see it in the reference photo, just adding the slightest bit of detail too. With the bush in shadow like that, I'm just painting the general shape and trying to keep it looking a little bit sharp, like the jagged edges of that bush. Then I use some darker blue or green on the left there. The ground kind of continues pretty far back there. I'm just correcting the mistake I made earlier. And it adds some nice depth too. That green shadow definitely adds some context to those trees and kind of places them in the painting. Now I'm just adding some little bit of detail to the grass to make it not just one big wash. Adding some detail here also brings that part of the painting forward, and it is the closest thing to us, so that's the kind of effect we want to go for. But I don't want to overdo it, just a little bit of detail is fine. I'm still trying to keep it simple. Now I'm continuing the dark shadow on the right side of this house. In the reference photo, the shadow on the bush and on the grass almost blend together, so that's kind of what I'm going for. The shadow on the grass I do make a bit greener, but they're so dark that they blend together nicely. And I'm going to use that same color for the shadow that the truck casts. I add a bit of detail at the top to kind of make it look a bit more like grass is growing onto that building. Now I'm going to paint this dark part of the window, and in the reference photo, it's just one big block of dark color. And it looks a bit too dark how I paint it, but it is going to dry, and it looks a little closer to what's in the photo. And I'll use that same color to go over areas with similar values. Painting's almost done now, so I'm just adding some of our last darkest darks, like on the right side of this chimney. Just a super dark burnt sienna. In the second draft I did of this painting, the dark values on the truck were all way too similar, and I overused the super dark gray color. So I'm going to try to start off with the lighter dark grays and really try to separate the different values here. That's going to make this truck look a lot better and more true to life. Like, these seats look pretty dark in the photo, but they're actually some of the lightest grays on that truck. And they're more kind of a warmer gray too, since the light's going through that window. And then we'll move on to this axle, which is a bit darker. And then while I wait for those grays to dry, I'm going to paint this tree kind of popping out from the side here. I'm just going to try to keep this simple, just adding really sporadic brush strokes, all of a similar color. Trying to keep it kind of random, a little natural. I'm just trying to not overdo it. Just adding the perfect amount of twigs and branches. If I made this too detailed, it would draw way too much visual attention, and This side of the painting, I'm not really trying to draw the viewer's eye to. I want the viewer's eye to be directed to the stark value contrasts on the house. Now I'm mixing ultramarine and burnt sienna with very little water to make basically a black to paint the darkest parts of this truck, like these wheel wells. I used that color on the side mirror, but it doesn't need to be that dark, so I'm going to lift that and then make it a little bit lighter. And then I'm going to do the same thing to this left wheel here. It should be a tiny bit lighter. It's not quite as dark as the other places on the truck. It takes me 3 times to get that color right. Then I'm going to use the same color I painted this tree to add a little bit more detail with some sticks poking out of the top. I kind of wish I painted the trees in this painting a little bit more abstract, a little bit more weird. I feel like right now they're kind of sitting in a bad place between realism and impressionism. I don't know. Just kind of an awkward space between those two. I'm trying to paint this tree that comes out behind this roof super faded so it falls into the background. I make my paint much lighter and then I kind of dab at it to fuzz it up a bit. I thought I made these orchard trees a little bit too flat, so I add a bit of shadow to make it more three-dimensional. And then I'll darken up my green mixture to add this super dark shadow under the truck. And then I'm using really a dry brush of some dark blue to add in a little bit of detail on that guardrail back there. Same thing with these shadows on that barn. This is all just super light dry brushing for our final details. Now I'm making sure I didn't miss any areas of the paint, like where that tree should be between the house and the barn. Painting in this power line, I want it to be a little thicker while it's closer to us and then kind of get thinner as it goes back towards the house. And then I sign the painting because we are done. Let's take the tape off. Wow.
We make it look easy.
All right, now let's do a little bit of a comparison. So this is our second draft.
Perfect.
And then here's the final third draft. I think there's a noticeable improvement, not only in our values, but also the saturation of our paints and the colors. It's definitely closer to the vision I had going into this painting, so I'll call that a success. I would also say it's a bit closer to the whole Edward Hopper style idea that I have in my head. And I think it's a nice little painting, it's simple, it's okay. I already know what I'm painting next, and it's going to be a lot more ambitious and complicated, so hopefully it'll be better.